Today, I want to give you a step-by-step guide for interior design. I'm going to cover everything from what interior design is, to decisions around layout, lighting, and color, and the common mistakes beginners make. Let's begin. Interior design gets misunderstood all the time, and especially by beginners. Most people think interior design is about picking a style, buying furniture, and making things look good. And that is part of it, but it's not the core of interior design. Interior design is about shaping how a space works for the people who spend time in it. It's about function first and form second, which means that if a room looks beautiful but doesn't support the people who use it, it's poorly designed no matter how aesthetically pleasing it is. So at its most basic level, interior design is the thoughtful arrangement of space, light, and objects to support human behavior. But you've probably heard a few other terms like decorating or styling that seem similar to interior design, and they are related, but they're not the same thing. Decorating focuses on surface level choices, things like art, accessories, colors, and finishes. Styling is about how a space is presented, especially for photographs. But interior design goes deeper than that, because designers ask questions like, what purpose does this room serve? Who uses it at what times of day and for how long? And what feels awkward or annoying about it right now? Once you understand that interior design is problem solving, not shopping, everything changes, because you stop chasing trends and start paying attention to your own deeper needs. Before you think about furniture or colors, it helps to understand how rooms actually function on a fundamental level, because every room is shaped by three things: light, movement, and use. And when a room feels uncomfortable, it's usually because one of these three is working against you. Light shapes how a room feels throughout the day. Natural light changes direction, intensity, and color depending on time and orientation. And artificial light fills the gaps that natural light leaves behind. If the lighting in your room is flat or harsh, the room will feel lifeless no matter how nice the furniture is. But if the light is layered and well placed, the room instantly feels more inviting. Now, movement is about circulation. How do you enter the room? Where do you walk through it? Do you need to pass through the space to get somewhere else? Or is the room a destination of its own? Rooms feel bad when paths of movement are blocked, unclear, or forced around furniture. So you should be able to move through a room without thinking about it. And use might be the most overlooked of these three, but it comes down to what actually happens in this room. Is the room for sitting, sleeping, working, reading, relaxing, or hosting other people? Most rooms fail because they're designed for an idealized version of life instead of our true habits. So you need to be honest about how you actually use a space if you want to design it effectively. But once you understand light, movement, and use, you start seeing rooms differently, and you notice why some spaces feel effortless while others feel tense. And that understanding becomes the foundation for every decision that comes after it. One super important step that so many beginners skip is learning how to read a room before trying to improve it. Because every room already tells you a lot. You just need to slow down and pay attention to what it's saying. So start with the basics and measure your room. Not approximately. Use a tape measure or a laser to measure the wall lengths, ceiling height, window widths, and door clearances. Because guessing the size of your room results in furniture that's too small, too big, or just awkward for your space. But measurements ground your decisions in reality. Next, identify the fixed elements in your room. Windows, doors, radiators, and load-bearing walls aren't easy to move. So rather than fight these things, you need to design around them, because your home becomes so much easier to work with when you accept what's fixed and use it as a starting point rather than an obstacle. And then understand the natural light. Which direction do the windows face? When does the room feel brightest and when does it feel dark? How the light hits your space affects where your seating should go, where to add workstations, and how much artificial lighting you'll need to bring in. And once you do this, you stop forcing ideas into the space and start working with it, and that's when design decisions suddenly become clearer and easier to make. This next step is where a lot of people make mistakes because they either rush through it or they skip it entirely. They assume the purpose of a room is obvious and they just move on. But just calling something a living room or a bedroom is too vague because two people will use their living rooms and bedrooms in completely different ways. And that's why you want to think in terms of dominant behavior. What's the one thing you want out of this room more than anything else? And don't think theoretically, look realistically. Look at how you already live. What do you actually do when you're in this room? If your open concept living dining room is where you collapse on the couch after work, that's totally fine. Just don't try to force it into being a more formal space just so you can host a fancy dinner party once a year. And this is important because well-designed rooms are opinionated. They make certain activities easier and other activities harder. And that's not failure, that's focus. For example, a living room designed for conversation will never be ideal for watching TV. And a living room designed around TV will never be great for conversation. And trying to do both in the same space usually results in a room that doesn't do either activity particularly well. Of course, there are ways around this by using modular furniture and getting creative in other ways. So don't be concerned if you've got a smaller space that requires you to combine multiple activities in a single room. The important thing is that you should always design with a purpose in mind. Otherwise, if you don't know where you're going, how will you know once you've arrived? But when you clearly and honestly define what a room is for, all your design decisions become easier. You stop asking, does this look good? And you start asking, does this support what I actually do here? And that shift removes confusion, speeds up your decisions, and leads to rooms that feel good rather than just looking good. Once you know what you want out of your room, you need to start thinking about layout, because a room with a good layout can feel comfortable with very little in it, but a room with a bad layout never quite feels right, no matter how much money you throw at it. And layout is about how everything in your room relates to everything else. So as you'd expect, furniture plays a big role in layout, but it's not the only piece. Rugs, lighting, side tables, plants, and even negative space all shape how a room feels to be in. And when the layout is wrong, it's usually because these elements aren't working well together. So if you want to improve your layout, start by identifying the focal point of the room. This is the piece everything else should organize around. In the living room, that's usually the sofa. In the bedroom, it's the bed. In the dining room, it's the dining table. The key here is that the focal point should feel like the center of activity in the room, not something that's been pushed aside to make space. From there, you want to pay attention to orientation, because furniture isn't just placed, it also needs to be pointed. Seating usually wants to face other seating or whatever activity the room is built around. Lighting should line up with where you actually sit, stand, or spend time, not just in a random corner. And rugs should visually connect your furniture, grounding it as a group rather than sitting on their own like an afterthought. And it's when these elements get out of sync with each other that the room starts to feel restless and uncomfortable, even if nothing looks obviously wrong. And then there's spacing. When the items in your room are too far apart, it feels cold and disconnected. But when they're too close, it feels cramped and tense. So the goal is a middle ground where things are close enough to interact naturally, but not so close that the room feels compressed. And before you trust your instinct to push everything against the walls to make the room feel bigger, don't. That just flattens your space. Instead, experiment with different furniture setups and don't be afraid to let in some empty space to give your room a bit of depth. Once the main furniture pieces are working well together, the next layer of layout comes from what I'd call the anchors of the room. These are the elements that visually hold everything in place. So that's rugs, curtains, and other large grounding pieces. When these are done right, the room just feels good, like everything belongs where it is. But when they're done wrong, even a decent furniture layout can feel unfinished or unstable. And rugs are the biggest one, because a rug isn't decoration, it's a layout tool, and its job is to connect furniture and define a zone. When a rug is too small, it makes everything sitting on it feel disconnected, like the furniture is hovering instead of playing nicely together. In most rooms, the rug should sit under the main pieces of furniture, not just float in the middle of the room, because the goal is for the furniture to feel integrated, not scattered. And curtains do a similar job job vertically. Curtains hung too low or too narrow make the room look squat and constrained. But when curtains are placed higher and wider, they frame the room instead of chopping it up. They also help define where the visual boundaries of the space actually are, which affects how large or small the room feels. Larger curtains visually stretch the room upward and outward, making the space feel more open and balanced even without changing anything else. But smaller curtains do the opposite. They visually shrink the room, compress the walls, and make the windows look like isolated cutouts instead of part of the architecture. And then other big anchors, like cabinets, large plants, and floor lamps also influence layout. So these pieces shouldn't feel randomly dropped into leftover corners. They should reinforce the structure of the room and balance the weight of the room from one side to another. Because when anchors are doing their job, the room has a sense of stability to it and nothing feels like it doesn't quite belong. Another major component of layout is lighting. A lot of people think about lighting as a finishing touch on a room, but it's so much more than that, because how you experience the room is affected just as much by where the light comes from as where the furniture sits. And if you've got an existing layout problem, it just gets multiplied by poor lighting. So remember this: overhead lighting alone flattens the room. It lights everything evenly, which sounds good in theory, but in practice, it removes any sense of depth and comfort. And that's because rooms feel better when light comes from multiple different places at multiple different heights. So to dial in your lighting, start by looking at where you actually spend time. Where do you sit? Where do you stand? Where do you read, relax, and work? You should place lights near those moments, not just around the edges of the room, because a lamp next to a sofa instantly gives that seat purpose, and a light near that chair in the corner turns it into a destination instead of dead space. And once you start thinking about lighting this way, it stops being about adding lamps and starts being about shaping the room. Because you're not just making the space brighter, you're deciding which areas feel active, which feel relaxed, and which quietly fade into the background. Floor lamps, table lamps, and wall lamps all help define areas within a room. They create pockets of use and make the layout feel deliberate, because when lighting lines up with furniture placement, the room feels more intuitive. But when lighting feels purely decorative or random, the room feels the same way. Now, I'm not able to go super deep on lighting in this video, but if you want to learn more about how to light your space so it looks like this and this, I built a custom tool specifically to help with this problem, because so many of our rooms look like this, but they could look like this if we just paid a bit more attention to lighting. So if you want to get access to that tool and upload images of your own space so you can see how it would look with hotel level lighting, the link is in the description. Let's talk about color. Color might be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of interior design, but it's rarely the thing that should come first when you're actually designing a room. Because color works best when it's supporting decisions you've already made, not when it's trying to hold the room together on its own. And if the layout, furniture, and lighting in your space aren't working, color won't fix that. In fact, it usually makes the problem worse. That's why so many rooms feel busy or uncomfortable, even though the colors themselves aren't wrong. It's because the colors are being asked to do too much work. So as a beginner, it's a good idea to keep color simple, but that doesn't mean everything has to be black or white. Neutral colors come in a wide range of warm beiges, soft grays, muted taupes, off-whites, warm creams, and even clay or stone tones. But the reason these colors work well are because they give you flexibility. They're forgiving, they age well, and they let layout, lighting, and materials do the heavy lifting in the room. Neutrals also make it easier to adjust and refine a space. If something feels off, you can usually fix it with layout, furniture placement, or lighting without having to repaint or replace everything. And that breathing room is incredibly valuable when you're still learning. Now, that's not to say that bold colors are a mistake. They're just tougher to get right. Strong colors exaggerate layout issues, bad proportions, and poor lighting. That's why they tend to work better once you've trained your eye and understand how rooms behave. But until then, neutral spaces don't feel boring when they're done well. On the contrary, some of the most beautiful spaces we spend time in, like luxury hotels and high-end spas, lean heavily into neutrals because they know how powerful they can be. So color doesn't need to be bold to be effective. So if you ever feel unsure, pull back on color rather than adding in more, because a room that feels calm but slightly incomplete is far easier to work with than one that feels chaotic. Once layout, lighting, and color are all in sync, it's time for your room to really start to come alive. And materials and texture are what turn a nice space into one that really wows you. But this is also the part a lot of people skip, because textures are harder to see in photos and harder to describe, but you feel them immediately when they're done right. And materials do way more work than color ever will, because you can have a very limited color palette and still create a rich, layered space if the materials are right. But if everything in a room is smooth, flat, and synthetic, the space will feel cheap and lifeless no matter how tasteful the colors are. So the key here is contrast. Soft things next to hard things, rough next to smooth, matte next to slightly reflective, fabric against wood, wood against metal, stone against upholstery. These combinations give your eyes somewhere to move without making the room feel busy. And the best part is, you don't need a lot of them. You just need the right mix. And texture becomes even more important when you're working with neutral colors, because when color is quiet, texture is what creates depth. A woven rug, a nubby fabric, visible wood grain, and slightly imperfect finishes all add warmth to a room. And this is why neutral rooms that are done well never feel boring, because they have a variety of textures backing them up. But just like with color, as a beginner, restraint matters here. You don't need 10 different materials in the same room. Instead, a few materials repeated intentionally will always look better than a dozen materials all fighting each other. So repeating the same wood tone, metal finish, or fabric type throughout the room helps everything stay connected. And then small variations within that repetition keep it from feeling sterile. So if a room feels flat, the solution is almost never to add more color. Most of the time, the room just needs better materials or more texture. And once you start paying attention to how things physically feel, not just how they look, your spaces will start to feel more expensive and more comfortable without changing anything else. Just like color, decor is one of those areas of design people like to jump to first, but it's also easy to get wrong, because decor should never be the thing holding a room together. It's the final layer, not the foundation. And if a room doesn't already feel good without decor, adding more objects only adds clutter on top of an already dysfunctional space. But once your layout, lighting, color, and materials are all working, decor becomes easy. You're no longer trying to fix the room with stuff, you're just reinforcing what's already there. And that's the difference between a space that feels cluttered and one that feels well put together. And art is a perfect example. Art doesn't need to fill every wall. One properly sized, well-placed piece will always look better than a handful of small pieces scattered around. And art should relate to the furniture beneath it and sit at a height that feels natural when you're standing in the room. Because when art is too small or hung at the wrong level, it feels out of place no matter how nice the piece is. And the same goes for objects and accessories, where grouping really matters. A few objects grouped deliberately feel clean, but the same objects spread randomly feel messy. So decor is where restraint pays off the most, because empty space isn't unfinished, it's breathing room. And leaving some areas of your home untouched allows the parts you do decorate to truly stand out. At this point, it's worth pulling back for a second and talking about the mistakes almost everyone makes when they're starting out. Not because you should feel bad about them, because once you can spot them, you stop wasting time and money fixing the wrong things. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make is trying to solve everything with new purchases, because when a room feels off, the instinct is to buy something: a new chair, a new rug, maybe a new lamp. Most of the time, the issue isn't that you don't have the right stuff. It's that what you already have isn't working yet. And most layout, spacing, and lighting issues won't be solved by swapping one object for another. Another common mistake is working in isolation. People design one corner, one wall, or one piece at a time instead of thinking about the room as a whole. But that's how you end up with nice individual elements that somehow don't add up. So every decision should relate back to the room's purpose and layout, and if it doesn't, it's probably not necessary. Then there are the mistakes of scale. Rugs that are too small, art that's hung too high, furniture that looks fine in a store but just disappears at home. And these issues quietly drain a room of its presence. So when something feels underwhelming, the reason often comes down to scale. And then there's the over-decorating trap. When people aren't confident, they keep adding more art, more objects, more layers. But excess stuff usually creates noise, not interest. And curating your space is a skill you need to practice, because removing something is often the best upgrade you can make. If we revisit all the steps we just walked through, you can see how to approach designing your space, because interior design only feels overwhelming when there's no clear order to follow. But once you understand the sequence of things, everything slows down and it actually starts to make sense. So you should always start by understanding the basics of your room: how large, what's fixed, and how it receives light. Then you define the purpose of the room, not in theory, in real life. And that purpose becomes your filter for every decision that follows. From there, focus on layout, how the furniture and major elements of the room relate to each other. Then anchor the room with rugs, curtains, and larger grounding pieces. After that comes lighting, not as decoration, but as a way to shape how the room is used. And only once those things are working do you bring in color. And when you do, keep it calm and supportive rather than dominant. Then materials and texture add warmth and depth. And finally, decor comes in at the very end, once the room already feels good without it. If something feels off, don't panic and rush to buy something new. Just step backward through the process and identify where things went wrong, because 9 times out of 10, the issue shows up earlier than you think. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's that good interior design isn't mysterious. It's not about talent, taste, or having some special eye that other people don't. It's about making decisions in the right order and paying attention to how a space actually feels when you live in it. And most of the frustration you'll experience comes from skipping steps, jumping to color too early, decorating before the layout works, buying things before understanding the room. But when you slow down and follow a process, the room starts telling you what it needs instead of you guessing. And the goal here was never to turn you into a designer overnight. It's to give you enough structure that you stop second guessing every choice. So when something feels off, you know where to look. And when something feels right, you understand why. Because interior design isn't about chasing perfection. It's about alignment between the space, the furniture, and the way you actually live. When those line up, the room doesn't just look better, it feels better. And that's when design stops being stressful and starts serving you in every other part of your life. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, I'd love it if you shared it in your favorite design subreddit, or with someone you know who also appreciates beautiful spaces. And if you want to get more design advice like this, click the link in the description and drop in your email. Some of my best stuff only gets shared with my email subscribers, so you don't want to miss it. But now that you're more comfortable with the basics of interior design, you're gonna want to take your skills up a notch. So watch this video next, where I walk you through one of the unique frameworks I've developed to help you make one of your most important decisions in designing a beautiful home.